Hey, good morning, everyone. In U.S. History 1, I was going to put up a quick review of Chapter 10 on religion and reform. Uh, it's a chapter I really, really like. It's not a lot of test fodder in here. There are some issues that come up. There are some very important historical issues related to anti-slavery ferment during this time. But some of the other concepts of the Second Awakening and other social and economic changes that occurred during this period of time have a lot of theoretical overtures to them, meaning causation, reaction, and interpretation are more in terms of a set of beliefs and philosophies that can be viewed with broad spectrum. I don't think it's always as concrete as on this date, this battle was fought or this person was elected, things like that. It's got a more of a thematic flow to it. So I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible. Chapter does a great job. Starts off with it's the Second Great Awakening. It's almost 100 years later. We had that first Great Awakening that existed both in Great Britain and in the United States. This move away from Calvinist theory of, hey, you're either saved or you're not. It doesn't matter what you do for good deeds. And there's a clear hierarchy in the church that determines protocol and dogma, and you have to obey, or a vengeful God is going to punish you severely. And hell was something very, very fearful on many people's minds. That the prospect of going to hell and not being saved was huge. You couldn't be saved by good deeds. But in the First Awakening, as well in the Second Awakening, there was this concept of being saved, that you could, through living a good life consistent with the teachings of God and of the gospel, you could in fact be saved, which was just like in the First Awakening, was contradictory to many of the Calvinist beliefs of being preordained to being saved or not saved. This was even bigger. The Second Great Awakening starts around 1820s, goes all the way through the 1850s. It's a huge movement. It's nationwide. It's almost worldwide, too. It happens in Europe, just like the First Great Awakening happens as well. And what is it? It's a very egalitarian concept of faith. No longer do you need the hierarchy of the church or church leadership and authorities within the church to tell you that you have a relationship with God or the deity or righteousness. It's all within you. And outward expressions of emotional attachment and sort of soul awakening was within you. You didn't have to have an intermediary through a preacher or anything like that. But these preachers would travel throughout the nation and really rev up crowds significantly. And people say, well, why did it happen? Why was it so successful? Why was it so big? There's where the theories come in. And I do enjoy the discussion of why the Second Great Awakening was so popular. And one of the arguments was we started becoming much more urban at that time. A lot more immigration was going on that time. Recent immigrants found a disconnect in community. Well, I don't want to say a loneliness, but they're looking for answers. They feel isolated from community in the way they weren't when they were back in their original homeland. That's one argument. The other is the economic upheaval. Some people are getting very wealthy, some are midline, but some are very, very poor and struggling. In this religious sort of vacuum helped people find solace and meaning and connection to a greater community through faith. And it was a huge deal at the time, and you can't underestimate it. And I love reading these stories of some of the great preachers that went through. And it's on the little quiz I just posted about the burnt over region of upper state New York. There were so many revivals there, and so many people attended that they wouldn't, future ministers wouldn't go into that area to preach because all the souls already had been saved. They would be preaching to empty audiences because they already felt this sort of like it was burnt over territory. It was already done so many times in that region. But it was egalitarian in the sense that you didn't have to be rich, you didn't have to be poor, you didn't have to have some kind of, I came from a good family, therefore I'm likely to be saved because I'm, one of the Salton Stalls or, the original Mayflower family that were Puritans. I'm just, and I could be a slave. I could be a African American. I could be a Native American. I could be of almost any previous religious faith, and I could still find God. And that's a very egalitarian aspect to it. And the church started changing as well, too. The Methodists went from a very small church to having, I think, somewhere around 35% of the population by 1850 recognize themselves as being part of the Methodist faith. And the Methodist faith didn't require their ministers to necessarily go through a great deal of theological education. They didn't go to colleges and things like that to be educated. All they had to have was an experience, a religious experience. I studied a lot of religion myself, so I always find this period of time very, very fascinating. I've gone to some revivals just out of curiosity, and you can see it. You can see the emotion of the people. And women, it was an egalitarian movement as well, too, in the sense that women were allowed to participate and express these moments of feeling revelation, if you will, and feeling, connectedness to the Holy Spirit, if you will, and all that kind of stuff. So it was rich, poor, black, white. It didn't matter what previous faith you were, what family you were from. All were welcome to connect with their God. And that's the kind of where the saying's from, is that, your personal relationship with God. Calvinists in previously more organized faiths like the Congregationalists were not consistent with that view. And people are basically moving away from those formalized sort of hierarchy in order to get closer to God, in this belief that you could be saved later in life by doing good deeds and being a religious and righteous person. I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but I always thought this to be very, very a fascinating period of time. And it does create an egalitarian, a uniquely American experience, although it was happening in Europe as well. But it was consistent with American values that you didn't always have to be part of the aristocracy or the wealthy in order to have just an important place at the table with God, if you will, than anybody else. So I think it's sort of, there's a great groundwork for that kind of faith message would work well in the American psyche for no other reason. And then they talk about some of the different leaders that were around at that period of time. Again, in order to be a Methodist leader, you would only have to necessarily have a conversion experience. You wouldn't have to have special training in the gospel or the history of Christianity or the like. Other faiths that started during that period of time, called the Mormons. The Mormons don't want to be called Mormons now, but they're now called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They were started by a guy by John Smith, had a revelation that he spoke to both God the Father and Jesus Christ himself, and told them that the other formalized churches got it wrong, and that there's a correct way and methodology by which you should worship, and that started the faith. And that group actually got a lot of, like other religious groups did, got a lot of ill treatment because they were considered to be secretive, and they are a secretive group, or were, and maybe they are in some level still to this day. They were persecuted in New York, so they moved to Indiana, and eventually they moved out of Indiana to where they still have a very prevalent population that will prevalent all over the world now, but they became prevalent in the just outside of Provo, Utah, where they found some sanctuary from violence. But John Smith was ultimately killed by a mob because people were suspicious of the Church of Latter-day Saints. They were suspicious of their leadership, and they were suspicious of John Smith specifically because he was talking about running into politics and running in the membership of the Church of Latter-day Saints tended to be fairly successful financially. And so there's a real fear that this group was a bit elitist and was also, because secretive and by nature, that they threatened sort of the undercurrent of society. And John Smith was murdered as a result of that. And many of the members of the Church of Latter-day Saints were persecuted. If you really like history like I do, Mitt Romney's father, a guy named I should know Mitt Romney's father's name. I got his political buttons all over the place. George Romney. George Romney was running or talking about running for presidency in 1968, way back then. He was the president of American Motor Company, AMC. They don't make them anymore. I don't know if it merged or just completely shut down. But very successful man. And he talks in several interviews about what it was like, I think at one time having to, fearing for the safety of his family, having to, whether it was him or his parents, having to live in Mexico for fear of persecution by other outsiders. But that's when the faith started. It's not that old a faith, if you will, the Church of Latter-day Saints. All these different groups were being developed. The Shakers are another group that came out. I don't think there's any living Shakers right now, unless somebody starts it up again. The Shakers had a really unusual faith in that they believed in absolute celibacy, absolutely no sexual relations at all. So you're not going to have children become part of the church. You had to have new members always coming in. And with the Shakers were fairly significant in Western Massachusetts for a period of time. And you probably heard the term Shaker furniture. That's what they were. One of the things they did find, they almost were kind of a utopian society. They often lived together in communities, very tight knit, in several like homes in like a small town. They would start up the Shaker community. They were very festive people, very close knit, very. Some people mistake them for Quakers. They're not Quakers at all. But what their lasting lineage is, I hate to say this, is one is their reputation for celibacy, and therefore almost self-defeating prophecy that their faith is going to end because you're not going to have kids going to faith, and you have to keep recruiting new ones. But they were a very, very tight-knit group, very peaceful group, and I don't have any pieces of it, but I collect like antiques, and I got some nice furniture. I don't have any Shaker furniture. I wish I could afford it. They made beautiful, beautiful, simple in design, but rugged and of the finest wood materials that one could find. I'm way off track on that. But the Shaker faith started and almost died, within 100 years of that period of time. Someone might come back and say, "Oh, there's a bunch of Shakers out in this area." Well, they obviously started up again, if that's true. So the concept of spiritual egalitarianism, we're all equal in faith. We all have the same God-given right to have a connection to God, to be a good Christian, if you will, really changed how the Protestant Americans thought about themselves, their God, and one another. It was really a phenomenon, and it really created, it was part of, don't forget, we just got away from Jacksonian, well, that way, it was during the Jacksonian democracy. And the Jacksonian democracy was the same in political body politic. The thought that we're all, at least in the politic part, it was all white males, but still, it was still a movement towards that conception of the great American experience is about equality, at least equality of opportunity. And that's the same in this faith movement that was happening during the Great Awakening. Many of these things started tying into, these religious groups also started tying into action. So it wasn't just about you being saved, it was about you trying to show through example your being saved made you want to be an example to other people. And they were a catalyst to this huge reform movement that happened in this time. And I wish the book explored the reform movement in greater detail than it had. Oh, and transcendentalism, I have to talk about that because that's Ralph Waldo Emerson. That's Henry David Thoreau right here in Massachusetts. Both of these people believed in it. Many others as well. And they had a belief in a higher spiritual principle, but that could be, you could trust your own intuitive thought process through your connection with nature to become very much an individual. You didn't need others to tell you how to think. And that's the old saying, I don't know if it was Emerson or Thoreau that said, I go by the beat of a different drummer. I go by my own tempo and my own belief system that I ascertain through my connection with nature and oneness with sort of the organization that God created. And there's not always easy answers to it, but you can glean them at least on some level through this connection through nature. And it was always a forward-looking, optimistic faith. I almost don't think of it as a faith, although one of my closest friends, his picture's right behind me, he was a transcendentalist. He really believed in that kind of optimism, but also self-reliance, which is also one of the famous short essays by, I can't remember if it was Thoreau or Emerson. I always think of them interconnectedly. They were close friends at one time. But they explained some things in the human experience are not easily explained by reason or logic. They established an early legacy precisely because they developed distinctly American ideas that emphasize individualism, optimism, oneness with nature, and a modern orientation towards the future rather than the past. And it was really popular in American history at that time, and it still resonates to this day. I know some people that believe that the essay of self-reliance is more important not only to develop your own, so don't follow what's going on TV, don't follow what's going on with these popular cultural iconic people. Decide for yourself. And I gotta admit, sometimes I say that when I see my kids worshiping a pop star or pop artist, and this person said that, I have no problem loving your music, but you decide for yourself how you want to go and what should be your decision about how doing things. That's why I'm not a big fan of endorsements. When I hear somebody, if I like Bruce Springsteen and Bruce Springsteen endorses a certain candidate, I'm saying, well, that's great, but I'm still going to make up my own mind. And that's a very transcendentalist thought. You have courage to be an individual. I don't think we have it as much as we used to. But anyways, that's another thing. Now these movements they're kind of going coincide. with the religious aspect of it is the temperate movement. Alcoholism became rampant during this period of time, even more than today, although I still think alcoholism is a huge blight on American society. And I'm not saying it because I'm a teetotaler myself. I drink alcohol, but I do recognize what alcoholism and abuse of alcohol can do to a person and to a family and to a society. It was nothing compared to what it was in the 1820s. It was unbelievable. The availability of cheap liquor, it was cheaper than milk or any other or any kind of juice product or anything like that. And water was often contaminated, so it's easier to drink cheap booze. Hard liquor I'm talking about beer. It was cheaper than beer too. The hard liquor was amazing, and the sales of hard liquor, I thought I wrote it down somewhere. I know I have it in a different book. Was something like 4 times per person what it is today. And I think today is pretty rampant. So people started getting worried that homes were being fractured by usually drunk men who were becoming abusive to their wives or their family members or their children. But more importantly, they were spending whatever money they had on booze. And so the temperance movement really, really took hold. It was actually a political party for a period of time. I collect political memorabilia. Every so often I get stuff related to the temperance movement in the early 1900s. But it started in the 1820s, and it was very successful in urging politicians. Many of them, these temperate movement members, were women. And they managed to get certain towns to go dry, meaning they would actually pass bylaws that no alcohol could be possessed or sold within their community. So when we think of the nationwide Volstead Act later that banned alcohol in the it have to be around late 1920s into the 1930s, that had roots all the way back here into the 1820s, and they had some success curbing alcohol. And there's some good art prints that came out during this era, and I believe they're by Curry and Ives. The Courier artist did 2 of them here. One is the Tree of Temperance, which shows how you can stay healthy and moral and be connected with God if you avoided the drink, as they called it. And then they show another tree where it's kind of rotten and decadent and soured, if you will, if you are drinking too much. And they have this, I like this one over here on the drunkard's progress from when they first start drinking casually and they get up into more and they start becoming violent and getting in trouble and lose their career. And by the end, the last step is suicide, according to a little art piece. It's a big movement. The temperate movement was big. It was partially religious, but it was also partly just a recognition, especially the women were involved in these groups. Women were in child labor, that should be mentioned here in this book. Child labor advocacy becomes huge. Also caring for the poor in the inner city communities, because cities were developing rapidly, becoming more urban. And what do we do with the poor who are uneducated, unclean, and don't have appropriate hygiene? Educate these, not only religious groups, but also women groups would often be the cutting edge of social reform. And it wasn't the government. We later started pressuring the government through labor laws for children and also things like the welfare system in the 1930s. But back in this era, it was up to people to voluntarily get together, usually with religious organizations, but sometimes purely what we consider fraternal organizations outside of religion, got together in a big way to try to curb some of these social ills that we viewed. And the biggest one, the most successful of all, was the temperate movement, trying to stop people from consuming alcohol. Yeah, in the 1840s, Americans drank half of what they had in the 1820s. Half. Per capita consumption continued to decline over the next 2 decades as well. So there was a huge drinking problem back then. And it's not just drinking problem for your own health, but if you ever know anybody who's been a troubled alcoholic, there's plenty of functioning alcoholics too. Not to get too deep into this whole thing, but really troubled alcohol. They won't work, they can't work because they're too sickly, and all they're doing is chasing the next drink. And they often tend to be, if not neglectful, certainly abusive to people whom they love. And it's a disease. And boy, they were really trying to tackle it back in the 1820s. So it's nothing new. People could say now that the new alcohol is opioids, but I still think the new alcohol is still alcohol. It's still a huge problem with many, many people. But anyways, the evangelical society often fought these things. So that's why some religious groups often seem to be ill-suited towards alcohol. But ironically, there's a tension here because many of the religious organizations use alcohol in their ceremonies, not hard liquor, obviously, but wine. And it's often related to ceremonies within the faith to consume alcoholic beverages. So there was some tension there, especially many of the recent immigrants were Catholic and they were poor and they often drank and they often felt the middle class is the one trying to impose this ban on alcohol on them. So there was a class tension over the question of banning of alcohol. I always thought that was kind of interesting. They talk about different ways you wanted the benevolent empire during this period of time. The Temperance Crusade was the most successful, no question about it. They actually made some headway. They did well. We know they get very successful in the 1920s. They basically get people elected to Congress, and they get politicians scared too, not to do something about basically banning alcohol and drinking of alcohol in our society as nationwide. And it was significantly respectable middle class and poor women that ran this temperance movement more than anybody else. It's a great success. Yeah, for optimistic, religiously motivated America, no problems seem too great to solve. With God on your side and with economic middle class liberation, because you did have leisure to do these things, you could tackle and help ward off some of the social ills that were occurring. One of the sad parts in the story, I wish they kept it separately under a political one, is the famous case of Worcester versus Georgia. Worcester is just the name of one of the litigants, not Worcester, Massachusetts, had nothing to do with it. But they were missionaries. These were religious missionaries working with the Cherokee Nation down in Georgia. They were converting many of them to Christianity. They owned a significant amount of land under treaties, but then they were a sovereign nation within a nation. One of the big debates why Native Americans weren't considered American citizens for a long time, because they were citizens of their own nation. But these Cherokees were being removed by the state of Georgia under the Indian Removal Act and saying, hey, you guys got to get west of the Mississippi. We don't want you around. We want your land. And they took the case all the way to Supreme Court. John Marshall, one of my favorite guys, he's the great Federalist on the court. But he's also a guy that sometimes makes controversial decisions. And what was the controversial decision? That he and the other majority on the court said that the Native Americans, the Cherokees, had every right to retain their property in Georgia, and the state of Georgia, nor can the federal government remove you. And when the Supreme Court makes a decision, the federal government, through its power, the military, they didn't have the FBI, but the different agencies have to enforce it. This is one time they didn't. Andrew Jackson actually came down with a quote saying, "Oh, John Marshall's made his decision. Let's go see him enforce it." And then he basically encouraged the state of Georgia to remove the Cherokees, and they did. And it was called the Thousand, or there's a couple names for it, but the famous one is the Trail of Tears. Over 1,000 miles, these people were forced to walk, basically removed from their lands, and to walk basically to cheap, I shouldn't call it cheap, but unattractive, non-agrarian or beneficial lands in the Oklahoma region west of the Mississippi. And the reason why it was a Trail of Tears, many little kids and older adults, elderly people, they died. A significant number of Cherokees died on that. A mass exodus that was forced by the state of Georgia with the blessings, basically, the federal government outside the Supreme Court. It's one of the few times the Supreme Court just basically gets ignored. They made a ruling and federal government says, ignored. It's kind of shocking. I'll probably put an essay question on that one for that one. Aren't we glad that we have checks and balances, even if the Supreme Court says something we don't like? We tend to expect the other branches to abide by it. Otherwise, we have a constitutional crisis. There was one, it's right in this way, anti-slavery and abolitionism. This came up big. One of our own Massachusetts citizens, William Lloyd Garrison, was a huge one. Does it mention him first here? It does. William Lloyd Garrison, the problem with him, I shouldn't say problem, but it's like a lot of people that advocate for certain justice standards. Sometimes they go so far that they get a negative reaction. And he said the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, not the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, that's where truth lies. All men are created equal, and that's what we should go on. He said the Constitution was a racist document, basically protects slavery. And he would go, and it's not in the book, but he would actually go to some of these meetings he'd have, and he would burn the Constitution. Because of his strong stance about immediate emancipation of African Americans and full citizenship rights to vote and participate in own property, was seen as anti-union and basically so radical that people in the North even hated him. And it was one of those tensions, and sometimes I debate like a political science class, that sometimes if you push too far, you won't even get a half a loaf, you'll get nothing. And William Lloyd Garrison actually met with a lot of frustration. One of his supporters, a printer, was actually murdered as a result of mob in the Northeast. It wasn't in the South. The South clearly hated William Lloyd Garrison, but many people in the North did too. And that's the problem with the anti-slavery movement. It's fractured. We have some groups that want to do a colonization project. Let's get Africans freed from slave and let's send them back to Africa. And William Lloyd Garrison actually supported it initially. Then later he recognized that as a racist sort of phenomenon. They should have every right to stay here in America and be Americans and participate in our society just as much as anybody else. But there were even African Americans who were freed that talked about the recolonization back to Africa. It's a Sierra Leone country founded on that kind of concept, Ghana and those areas. And then there were other groups that said, no, we got to do it gradually. We got to first emancipate. Then we'll talk about later about participation. Maybe we can create basically things like the Indian reservation system for African Americans. There wasn't a clear message, and there was fractured groups within it. And women, because they were so significant in leading some of these groups, that even that would fracture some of the anti-slavery movement from success, because some people say, well, I love the idea, but I'm not going to work with these women who are taking positions of power within the group because they were sexist. And so they really, really had a tough time becoming uniform. But the heyday of it in the marked peak of the abolitionist movement birth really starts in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and we know we go to the Civil War in the 1860s. The abolitionist movement never had any success in any outright fashion politically. In fact, what created even greater tension was the South was successful as a result of the Compromise of 1850, getting teeth into the fugitive slave law, which punished people that either helped runaway slaves, but also punished people that didn't actually take overt action to help capture them. And so, but the movement's out there. People are talking about it, and literature is done. They have the famous newspaper, The Liberator. I don't know if it was actually out of Massachusetts, but it was done by William Lloyd Garrison. And that's all that newspaper did, was advocate against the evils of slavery, along with religious iconic beliefs. And what I just can't help but mention this for personal reasons, is John Greenleaf Whittier was one of the Quakers and philosophical believers in doing away with slavery. And I love that because I'm not a big fan of cliche quotes, but his is probably my favorite. He was a writer. He wrote poetry, and one of his poems ends with this concept of no sadder words have either been either written or granted by tongue than it might have been. And I always love that take a risk, go do something, and there's no greater feeling or of disappointment than regret and not taking the shot, is basically what it transfers to. But he's mentioned here, he was one of the great leaders as a writer during that period of time. And we know that William Lloyd Garrison was really, really motivated by Northern philosophical writers named David Walker and James Forten, both these really fiery speeches he bought into and really wanted to do it. But boy, did he get a lot of pushback. And even in the North, even people that wanted to end slavery thought he was going way too far. And that's part of the reason why it became fractured. Some people call them the immediatist. They wanted immediately slavery. Others with a gradual maybe future generations of, born to slavery would be given emancipation. So these kind of debates went on and on and on. And we know that there was actually a thing in Congress that was created called the gag rule. The gag rule allowed no debate or open discussion of abolitionist movements because it was so fearful to cause violence in the Congress. Yeah, it says Whigs and Democrats joined forces in 1836 to pass an unprecedented restriction on the freedom of political expression known as the gag rule, prohibiting all discussion of abolitionist petitions to the House of Representatives. Kind of shocking when we think of First Amendment rights of free speech, especially political speech being the purest. We come to absolute protection. Even then, our own political leaders say we just can't stop it. It's just too acrimonious, too much filled with hatred. There is a mention, and there should be mention of others, but we know Frederick Douglass, who was a freed escaped slave, very educated, very articulate. He became a symbol of showing the world that African Americans are just as capable of being intellectual and capable and literate as anybody else. And he spoke over in England, like many others too. There was many other African Americans during this period of time that were free, that showed that they could be part of society just like anybody else. And he was celebrated in the Northeast, and he was vilified in the Southern realm. I'm surprised they don't mention Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, because it is a very strong revelation of sort of and it's done in a very creative way, in a soft way. It really, really vilifies the nature of slavery, and it creates sympathy for the anti-slavery movement during this era. But anyways, so these different parties come up based upon anti-slavery. They're very fragmented, and they never really get any success. The only way we end slavery is through the Civil War and the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, and we fight racism to this day. And it's really unfortunate. And now women's rights. Women fought for rights since the Revolutionary War, I should say. They fought for recognition at a time, and they participated in many aspects of society. During this era, they were an important part, and they were recognized as an important part of the American backbone of morality, of education, of stability in our homes. And sometimes they call it the cult of womanhood. Women were expected to treat and educate children on civility, civics, morality, religion. And because they had that great important role, they were revered in society. But they weren't revered so much that they should be able to vote, participate in politics, either as a candidate or with the power to vote. But they were starting to advocate for it very strongly. In fact, because these women groups were fighting for things like prison reform, that's one of my favorite stories, because for a long time we didn't have prisons in this country. You used to either get killed, beaten, or fined. There wasn't like a real big conception of prison, and what prisons we had were just absolutely horrendous, cruelest institutions in the world. But it was during this period of time that prison reform came into place, and that's why we called it the House of Correction, or we call it the penitentiary, so you can do penance and think about your wrongdoing so you can come out a reformed individual. That was a movement largely led by women. I'm not saying there weren't men involved, but these women were the backbone of many of the intellectual designs on trying to improve the ills of America. One of was the mental institutions, which today we look back and say, oh my God, I can't believe it. It was still about humanitarianism. They were still trying to do the right thing. And same with prison reform. But in the process, they're leading all these movements, and they're big players in the anti-slavery movement. But what they themselves start recognizing or start getting more vocal about is, what about us? We're doing all these things for everybody else, but we can't participate. And I think there was one movement. There was I think it was two of the sisters, the Grimley sisters, that went over to England, and they weren't allowed to speak because they were women on some anti-slavery issues at a big, basically global convention over that question. They come out so outraged that they start really, really pushing for women's rights and women equality in terms of the ability to vote. And we know they finally held a big. You got to have a test question. I'm surprised I didn't put it in a little quiz, but I'll definitely put it on the next. The final is about the Seneca Falls Convention. And here's the thing: I've been to Seneca Falls to visit the National Women's History Museum there. It's a federal historic landmark, and there's a museum there, and it's quite good. I really enjoyed myself. I'll be quite honest. I didn't go there for that, but I did go there to visit it, and I was very much impressed by the history of the women's movement fighting very, very hard. In 1848, they came out with a list of grievances, just like the Declaration of Independence, and they said all men and women are created equal. Then they listed a bunch of grievances, just like we did against the King George of England, but they listed them largely against men, and rightly so, that were basically denying them right to participate in the civic life. And a majority of the participants were women, but men were there too, and they signed that document. Did it get anywhere? Not until 1919, 1920, when women finally do get the right to vote nationally. I got to admit, before that, they did have some success in some states, but not too many until the turn of the century, got the power to vote. But they were pushing for it early. If you ever get up there, I urge you to see the museum. It's very well run. And there's, now with COVID, I don't know when you're going to get up there again to do it. But the real reason why I went to Seneca Falls, if anybody's curious, is it is the city that inspired the set of the movie It's a Wonderful Life. And most of you are much younger than me, but if you ever get the chance to watch It's a Wonderful Life, most of you younger, you won't want to watch it because it's old. I believe it's 1946 or 7, maybe 48. Black and white movie. It's always shown at Christmas time. Everyone says it's a Christmas movie. I don't believe it's a Christmas movie. Just set near Christmas. But it's the greatest movie ever told, and we actually have a copy of the play in my old law office, and all the lawyers, paralegals, and staff after a long day when some trials would be resolved, if we wanted to break half hour early and not do any work, we'd pass around copies of the play, and we'd each take a different role and play a scene out from It's a Wonderful Life. But it wasn't filmed there, but the bridge that's over the waterway in Seneca Falls, New York, is the motivation for Frank Capra to set his Hollywood design of what the town should look like for Bedford Falls. Those of you that know what I'm talking about, great. If not, don't worry about it. But these women were big, and what you can't underestimate when it comes to anything, whether it's Frederick Douglass as a freed African slave or women who don't have the power to vote, when you push against opposition, against power that you don't have, that's a very courageous thing. And they push. Women were fighting for everybody's causes, including their own, but they're the ones that get it last, really. And we know it was ultimately the Civil War that we had to get rid of slavery through that. And you wonder, if we didn't have the Civil War, if there was some other more appeasement during the long way, how much longer would slavery have lasted in sections of our country? It would have been remarkable. It says right here, it says they threw their bulk of support behind abolition, allowing the cause of racial equality to temporarily trump that of gender equality. But the words of the Seneca Falls Convention continue to inspire a generation of activists, even to this day. It's a real interesting phenomenon. But that's chapter in a nutshell. I went really long. I tend to be too talkative, as always. But anyways, be well. Don't be afraid to reach out, ask questions, or raise concerns.